I'm going to ask you for the next minute to pretend you do not know the story of the Three Little Pigs. And I'm going to describe a series of 3 activities to teach you that story. Now, in my planning, I've thought of what I consider to be the really important questions when planning any activity. Does everyone have access to it? Does it encourage engagement, sense-making, discourse, and reasoning? And I think in the case of these 3 activities, it does. So, with that, once upon a time, there were 3 little pigs building houses. Would you rather live in a house made of straw, wood, or brick, and why? Now, if we were in a classroom, I would ask you to turn to your neighbor, defend your choice, and share with the group. Activity 2, the wolf enters the story. I'd like you to put the pig where it belongs in the food web, and fill in all the other empty boxes with animals that make this open middle food web true. And for our 3rd activity, we're gonna watch Peppa Pig build a house out of bricks. We're gonna watch 14 seconds of it, try and estimate how long it might take Peppa to complete the house, and watch the end of the video to see how close we are. Now, reflecting on those planning questions, I think we would all agree that all 3 of these activities would offer students access, engagement, support, sense-making, discourse, and reasoning. But if I ask you to turn to your neighbor and retell the story of the 3 little pigs, I can imagine you would probably laugh me off this stage because that wouldn't even make sense. It would be confusing, and I imagine it'd be awkward silence and laughter around the room. And I think when I did this with adults, they said things like, I'm not sure what they would have learned. It felt like a forced pseudo real-life context, disjointed, felt like the extras that come with a reading series. And each one felt like an isolated experience. And I think those are all true. And I think it's because there's this disconnect between how we think about a mathematical story versus how we think about a story in ELA. And I don't think that should be the case. If we think about an ELA story, such as the 3 little pigs, if we pull any page out of that story, there's events that have led up to that page, and that page, the events on that page are leading to the next set of events. So when we think about the story of multiplication of fractions, and we want students to make sense of 5 times 1/4, there are events that have led up to that moment, and there's understandings that that moment is building toward, that it should all follow a coherent mathematical storyline. So when we think about a tweet that goes out like, starting teaching fractions tomorrow, who's got an activity for multiplying fractions? We can't help but be bombarded with just all the activities, just like the ones we saw in the opening. And then we take all these activities and we tend to filter them by those 5 questions. Do they encourage engagement and sense-making? And I think all of us would agree that some of these do and some of these do not. But when it comes to connecting to the content, that's the hard part because we know the through line. Just like with the 3 little pigs, we could see how those activities connected to the story because we knew the story. And so when we're picking content, we know the story of multiplication of fractions, but the students in our classroom do not. Giving them access to an engaging activity does not guarantee access to the mathematical story, because while they might be successful in that moment, what happens the next day, what happens the next unit, and what happens the next year, they need access to the entire story. So we need to ask ourselves, before any of the others, 2 really important questions. What are students building on? And what are students building toward? Then we ask ourselves all of the other questions, because these questions help build the mathematical story. Eleanor Duckworth said it best, that making connections depends on knowing enough about something in the first place to provide a basis for thinking of other things to do and questions to ask. So if you ask me how to do this, I would say, curriculum, of course, period. But if you don't have one, I encourage you to read the progression document, consider prior grade level standards, think about the mathematical representations that help build that mathematical story in a connected, coherent way for students. And so when we ask ourselves these 2 questions, what are students building on and what are students building toward, our tweets change to be something where we're really giving students the story. And we tweet things such as, I start teaching 4th grade fraction multiplication tomorrow. Students understand multiplication as groups of, can add fractions with like denominators using tape diagrams, and I want to connect it to the number line. And if we tweet something like that, we get activities that give each and every student in our classroom access to the mathematical story.